Добрый день, Вера. Знаете, что главное будет? Начинается обратно.
Good afternoon. You know what's the most important thing? We are starting the count to the World Energy Congress that is going to be held in 2022 in St. Petersburg. It was hosted by the Soviet Union, but this is the first time for St. Petersburg. WEC is a very old organization. It was before Second World War. And right now we are starting the back count, and we're going to have Minister Novak of Energy. We're going to have Moscow, London, Germany, the US, and this is also going to be a webcast for Russia 24. And this is probably the first time that we're going to speak mostly English, and we're going to have simultaneous interpretation provided, so our viewers are not going to notice anything. We're going to switch languages all the time. So let us begin.
Hello, everyone, and a very good afternoon to those of you who are watching this live broadcast of ours in Europe, most of Africa, and in the Middle East. Very good morning to our good friends, I'm sure, in Britain, Western Africa, and the Americas. And a good evening to those of you who are in the rest of Russia, Asia, and Australia. Now, this is indeed a very special and global broadcast. In a moment, I'll start introducing our distinguished panelists. But let me first of all explain what this is all about. Now, some of us, like myself, still have peculiar lockdown periods haircuts, or rather the absence of proper haircuts. But even before I managed to visit a barber, later today I hope, I absolutely grasped this opportunity, this rare chance to moderate a truly international, brotherly maybe, that we will see later, televised session called Energy Future for All, which marks the beginning of our countdown to the first ever Congress of the World Energy Council, with headquarters in London, in St. Petersburg, Russia. And that is after a bizarre coronation street of this planet by a coronavirus. But what a life-affirming combination we have here. The session which you are about to watch has been co-organized by Roscongress Foundation with headquarters in the very St. Petersburg and the very World Energy Council. So from London, we're joined by none other than its Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Angela Wilkinson. Hello, Angela.
Hello, Sergey.
Lovely. We can hear you. You can hear us. Here in Moscow, I'm joined by His Excellency Alexander Novak, Russia's Minister for Energy, whom many of you will instantly recognize as one of the faces of the recent OPEC++ compromise. Здравствуйте, Alexander Valentinovich. Also, we are under watchful eyes, this I can see from here, of Dr. Leonhard Binbaum, who is, of course, a member of the Management Board of the EON, CEO at Energy, and Chair of the Studies Committee at the World Energy Council. He's joining us from Germany. Guten Tag, Mr. Binbaum. Dr. Herr Binbaum.
Good afternoon from my side to Moscow.
Lovely. May I also greet Helima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy, Global Research, RBC Capital Markets. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Well, in fact, given the time difference, it is still a very early morning in the United States, so we appreciate you joining us heroically, I'd say. And last but not least, Mr. Pavel Levinsky, Chairman of the Management Board and Director General of Rosseti, which is the company Russia's golden tsar as far as the electricity grid is concerned. Добрый день, Pavel Anatolich. Right, so we're being heard even in Moscow. I must explain to our viewers that Rosseti's support was more than instrumental in arranging this session. And one more important detail for our viewers. I'd imagine that most of you are watching us either via Russia 24 network or using Bloomberg's terminals, our media partners. But don't forget about your second screens. Namely, there's a chat where you can put your questions to our panelists, which I'll forward to them by the end of our meeting. The chat is conveniently available at WEC website and Roscongress's YouTube channel. So please free to ask questions. Right, I should also mention that our session is supported by Global Energy Association, of which I am indeed its newly elected president, although I'm no alien to this studio, either, as is in my normal life and under normal circumstances, I anchor my weekly program on this very channel. My name is Sergey Brilov. Okay, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? And I hope that our simultaneous translation is set so that I can safely switch into Russian to address on the Russian soil Minister Novak. Alexander Valentinovich, мы собрались...
Minister Novak. This is not just a coincidence that we've gathered here. 2022, it's going to be the year when Russia is going to host the WEC Congress in St. Petersburg. But right now, this is not the time for such solemn occasions because we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemics. The investment is plummeting. Investors and consumers' plans have been thwarted. What are we going to talk about in St. Petersburg? Is there going to be anything to talk about? Good day, Sergey. Let me welcome all the participants of the conference as well. Indeed, this is one of the first events in the run-up to the 2022 World Energy Congress in St. Petersburg. This is going to be an anniversary, 25th edition of the World Energy Congress, and it is going to be dedicated to the future of energy, as well as to how it's going to be a discussion about how to take into account the interests of everyone, of energy producers, of energy consumers, of new sources of energy, renewables, and I think this is going to be a very important discussion. And I think it is time for us to begin this dialogue right now, even though the crisis is not yet over, despite all the uncertainties that we see. Despite all of that, we can make some lessons. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to share some of my remarks before responding to your questions, before entering the discussion, of course. Go ahead. But before that, I would like to welcome Madam Wilkinson, as well as all the other participants of the conference who are joining us online. These are new realities we are meeting in, and it's been like this over the last couple of months. Of course, all of this has an influence upon us. Well, now, as for the lessons we can learn and we can emphasize, let me dwell on them a little bit. The first thing, in spite of the fact that the world economy is faced with an unprecedented shock, which is partly related to what is happening in industries, in markets, to decrease in demand due to the changed lifestyles of populations. At a certain moment in time, 1/3 of the world's population were in lockdown, in self-isolation, due to the measures imposed by the governments of several countries to overcome the pandemic. Despite of that, the energy sector was stable. And the energy covers a huge range of sectors and industries: oil and gas, coal, power generation, refining and processing, renewables, new alternative sources of energy. Despite the terrible crisis we witnessed, in particular in April and in May, we are still confident that the energy has proven that it can be stable. Yes, the electricity and the heating are still there. Yes, that's correct. The services are still being provided: heating, power, and high-quality oil and coal, as well as processed products. All of these industries are continuing to work uninterrupted, despite that. Of course, the world economy dropped, it contracted, and the energy also took the blow. We saw a decrease of 28 to 30%. Of course, the industries that have been hit hardest are air flight, entertainment, tourism, restaurants, small and medium enterprises, but energy has been hit as well. As we can see, the investment has decreased by around 30% across the industry. And despite that, the industry has turned out to be resilient and stable, despite the shocks in the world economy, despite the shocks in the financial markets and stock exchanges. The energy is still standing firm. Another lesson we can learn is that we are going to undergo a restructuring of energy. the forecasts, the projections that were made previously with regard to the energy are going to be adjusted significantly. And I refer first and foremost to the fact that people are going to change their lifestyles. The world population in the forthcoming months and years probably are going to use less their cars and planes. So the recovery is not going to be very fast. It's not going to be a V-curve. It's going to be a partial recovery. And then it's going to take quite some time to hit the pre-crisis indicators. And as we can see, the forecasts will have to be adjusted that are related to the structure of energy consumption and the energy production mix. There were forecasts that by 2040, the fossil fuels share is going, the hydrocarbons share is going to decrease from 85 to 76 to 75%. But I think the forecast is going to be adjusted. The decrease is going to be less. The 10% of change in energy. This is quite a significant change in the next 10 to 20 years. Anyway, as we can see, there is right now an explosion of new technologies, cloud technologies, digital technologies, which is also going to have an impact upon the development of energy. Electric energy is going to be increasingly in demand, and fossil fuel is going to be less used for that. Many governments, incidentally, many countries are announcing that remote work is going to be a permanent thing right now. Facebook, Twitter, some other companies are saying that in the next several years, 30 to 50% of their employees are going to work remotely, and it's going to be voluntary shift. So many companies are changing their strategies, their very mode of working, and this is the second lesson we can learn from what we've witnessed over the recent months. And the third lesson is as follows. Previously, we witnessed several radical shifts in climate change policies. We saw a mobilization of efforts with a view to achieving green energy. And right now, this dynamics, this very drive is becoming increasingly potent, putting pressure on the energy. So even though there is a decrease in consumer demand, electric cars are not going to be bought as often as they used to. Well, you know, there was a point when oil prices plummeted 3 times, and the gas prices, they decreased as well. And renewables became somewhat less competitive than they used to be. But still, many countries and many companies only intensified their policies in green energy. They tightened their standards in accounting and reporting and environmental standards. There are some announcements to achieve zero carbon net zero carbon rates by 2050, and this is a trend in energy we have to take into account. And this is something we have to take into account when talking about the global energy transition as well. That is, by the way, a very interesting addition to the recently adopted energy strategy.
Thing here, through which the torturers, known as my editors, have told me that I said erroneously World Economic Council rather than Energy Council. That's because I think I'm Russian in my soul, so 1/3 of the GDP of this country based on energy plays its role. However, the World Energy Council, Dr. Angela Wilkinson in London. Angela, do you want to learn a Russian word? Just one.
Спасибо.
It's pronounceable. No, настроение. Настроение. That's the mood, meaning the mood. How is yours? How is your настроение?
Настроение.
Oh, impeccable.
Thank you. Hello. Are we switching to me? I missed the sequence.
Yes, absolutely. So I asked about your mood, and that gives floor to you.
Thank you. Well, let me thank Minister Novak for, first of all, for his opening remarks, and also for his role as the chair of the Russian Federation Member Committee. And let me congratulate Russia for the first time in my role as Secretary General for their success in winning the bid to host the prestigious World Energy Congress in 2022. And when we last met, Sergei, we were both in Cape Town. I was still working through my first 100 days as the Secretary General, and I've had to change my 100-day plan several times since then. I don't think I'm ever going to make it to the end of a 100-day plan at the moment. We're now in the midst of a deeply human crisis, and we're starting up to face up to the realities that Minister Novak has referred to, the new realities of, I think, the greatest financial capital reallocation in history, the restructuring of the energy sector, the new ways of working, and a moment of potentially transformational change. And the COVID crisis has also highlighted, once again, the importance of energy in the everyday life of everybody on this planet, and shown that we can't take normal for granted. And I'm delighted to be here today to launch this series on the road to Congress that will be in St. Petersburg in 2022. Really thrilled that we're going to be in such a prominent energy nation, and I'm delighted today to be able to come along and share the insights of our unique global energy community around the COVID-19 impacts, actions and outlooks for what we are all facing in the days to come. Thank you very much for your welcome, Sergei.
Well, there's one coincidence between the British and the Russians. We are the only two countries in Europe where, when you say Europe, you mean whoever else other than yourselves. But let me ask you a European question. We are already here. St. Petersburg is in a couple of years. The panel today is focused on accelerating a better energy future for all amid the COVID-19 pandemic. I was going to say the C word, COVID. I'm so tired of pronouncing it. How is the World Energy Council looking at the impact of COVID-19 on energy?
So for us, COVID-19 is a brutal shock, and it hasn't happened in a vacuum. The Council, I think, has a unique ability to draw and pull together all of its members across the world and make sense of what is a fast-moving, very uncertain and very confusing situation, and put it into the broader context of what we were seeing before the crisis, what we're learning about the lessons now, and also thinking about what might happen next. And we can only make sense, we think, of this situation today if we also look at the before and the possibilities for after. And it's just 9 months ago that we were at the 24th World Energy Congress in Abu Dhabi, and we had over 15,000 members of the global energy community convened at the same time in Abu Dhabi. And the discussions then were highlighting this growing gap between human ambition and human action in managing a faster, inclusive and orderly global energy transition. And in Abu Dhabi, 75% of the Congress audience already felt that the global energy system was experiencing what we call our hard rock scenario, that the signals were of increasingly inward-focused governments, of international fragmentation, and strong national interest drivers. So the COVID impact doesn't come in a vacuum. It impacts on three existing or pre-existing stresses: economic, environmental, and societal. The global economy was already sluggish. Many energy companies were already anticipating global economic recession. Climate change momentum was increasing. After 7 years of reducing emissions, we were seeing greenhouse gas emissions from energy-related activities increasing again. And our community was also picking up new signals from many different countries about the new people power in energy and the rise of what we call the social agenda. We were talking about value creation moving closer to the customer and the end user, about the shift in leadership mindset to the customer-centric energy plus services system, and about the increasing visibility about social impacts and costs of accelerating a faster whole system turnover. So it's very important that we understand COVID doesn't happen in a vacuum and is an accelerator of these pre-existing tensions.
Well, anyway, the Coronation Street has been filled with COVID, with the coronavirus. What has the, well, mind you, I didn't refer to EastEnders. What has the World Energy Council learned over the past few months now that the coronavirus was around?
We've been surveying our expert energy community. Right. We've been regularly surveying our community of energy experts in nearly 100 countries for the last couple of months on the impacts, actions, and future outlooks. And what we can say, to use one of my classic phrases, is we are in a tuna situation. It's turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous. And we're learning that the health and well-being of people remains at the top of the organisational agenda across the energy sector. We're learning that all parts of the energy ecosystem have been impacted, not just big energy companies, but also startup energy transition entrepreneurs, as well as the fossil fuel sector, the hydro sector, the nuclear sector, and the renewables sector. We're seeing that there's drastic cost cutting in 4 out of 5 organisations, and Minister Novak referred to the decline in prices and the cost impacts, but I think it's important to remember that 40% of energy organisations are already reducing operational and capital expenditure by significant amounts, that the impact financially on the energy sector is 6 times that on retail. So it's a significant impact. And that although 1/3 of the firms tell us that they are planning to shed jobs, even though they are fighting to retain headcount as far as possible. We're also seeing, in addition to the cost cutting, 80% are significantly shifting their investments towards digitalisation of operations, towards research and development, and also towards what we call ESG governance, or environmental, social and governance activities. So this crisis is already having a significant impact on the energy sector. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the worst or the most impacts are still to come. We're still in the early phases of this crisis, and it's serving as a stress test for the entire global energy system.
When you quoted Mr. Novak now, Minister Novak, the screen was filled with your graphics, so you didn't see his reaction. And he was A, nodding, but B, there was that on his face, which is commonly known as the stiff upper lip, to which we will come back. Angela, I know that your presentation is far from over, but you've just used a word which occupies a special place in space, in Mr. Levinsky's vocabulary, the digitalization. Пан Анатольевич, обращусь к вам сейчас.
Mr. Levinsky, over to you. Speaking of digitalization and importance of digitalization, what do you have to tell about that? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Well, I have to say that digitalization means a shift in the logic of business processes. And I have to say that digitalization is primarily conditioned by emergence of new technologies and changes in consumer behavior. The purpose of digitalization is to give more flexibility and agility to the energy sector to be able to adapt to new challenges and to make sure we provide all our services reliably and sustainably. We have to think of the future solutions, and the system has to perceive new signals from the environment and be very transparent, both for the producer, including microgeneration of renewable energy, as well as for the consumer. And that would be the perfect outlook of digital transition that we're moving forward to. Well, for those who are not aware of the current situation in Russia, I would cite an example. If we have a blockage of the electric line in Russia, those would be Russian guys who would have to go into there and to check where the breakage is taking place. But now you can understand that remotely. Well, basically, that is the correct description of the situation. Now we have all the digital services that enable the system to recover itself very quickly, to be fault tolerant, to identify where the breakage took place and to easily recover it. We recover the supply of energy power in a very short period of time. And indeed, it's not just the system managed by a human, but it's now the human monitoring any deviations within the operation of the system, and they only react to all out of the ordinary situation. The rest is fully digitalized, and it's device-to-device communication without the engagement of a human. And we shouldn't forget about the customer. I'll get back to Angela after a very short pause, but now a question to you, Mr. Novak. The Global Energy Association was keeping a close eye on the debate that was happening in Europe and is still ongoing now during the time of crisis. Let's take a look at Germany. Germany is against the so-called brown economy or coal-driven economy. But on the other hand, right next to Germany, we have Poland, who is insisting that they want to keep producing coal. Germany is also against atomic energy. But exactly now, during those days and weeks, this conversation of the future development of nuclear energy is included in the development of the Russian plans and also in the United Kingdom. As for renewable energy, in your energy strategy, approved by the Russian government just several days ago, we see that together with the hydropower and renewable energy sources, we're paying a lot of attention to that. Although you mentioned that renewable energy sources are still very important, and by that I mean wind energy and solar energy are more applicable for remote regions, somewhere in Kalmykia, where solar power stations exist and are quite efficient. Those are the ones that I saw myself. But the situation is very different, even in Europe and certainly in the rest of the world. Can we talk of the preparation towards the Congress that is going to take place in St. Petersburg when everybody's having their own agenda that are very different? Sergei, you're right in asking those questions. What type of energy mix we need? That's basically the core of your question. And certainly every country makes choices depending on their peculiarity and define their own agenda. But all of us are setting ourselves an objective to make sure we provide for our own energy safety and security. We all need to have resources that make us independent from the import of energy resources, be that power energy or any other type of energy, and that is included in all national strategies. As for development of the agenda, it is very different. In France, 85% account for nuclear energy. Germany has set itself an objective to move on fully to renewable energy sources. In Scandinavia, hydro energy is very developed, and the same applies to Latin America. As for Russia, I think we have a truly diversified energy mix. Probably we have one of the best diversification in this regard in the world, and we are proud to say it. Because in our energy mix, we have virtually all types of energy production. That includes production of energy from gas. Around 50% of our energy mix accounts for gas. Around 18% goes to nuclear energy and nuclear power plants. 17% for hydro generation. Around 20% for coal. So that is a truly diversified energy mix that enables us to develop all sectors of energy industry and not be dependent from one of them. As for renewable energy sources, we're also developing it, and not just in isolated regions that you have mentioned. Although probably that is the most effective way to approach it, to replace those diesel generating units that can be quite expensive and costly in use, especially if it is expensive to export those types of fuel into northern regions and it has a big economic impact. But we also develop all of it in one single energy system. We have 6,000 megawatts of energy power that will be commissioned shortly. More than 1,000 is commissioned already, and all that is happening within the scope of creation of shared energy system in Krasnodar region and in Kalmykia. That is indeed a shared, united energy system. So we plan to develop this sector further in order to make sure we have necessary competences to produce the right equipment here in Russia, and also develop our competences to export those products, since they are truly competitive and high margin.
So you are talking about the production of Russian equipment, but as far as we know from a publication of Kommersant several weeks ago, some companies applied for act of God provision because yes, there are some issues. I know subsidies are provided at a federal level, but later about that.
What you were talking about before that. So what do energy companies, users, energy countries need to move forward?
Thank you. As I said before, we looked a little bit about what was happening before the crisis, and we've looked a little bit about some of the lessons and the impacts that we're seeing now. Of course, no one can predict what's going to happen next, but it is important that we start to think that it might take at least another year before we return to normal, and not forget that an increasing number of people in the world still require a lot more energy. So we need more energy, even as we're trying to work out how do we move forward with diverse interests and needs in regionally diverse energy systems, but we only have one planet and we have society to take care of as well. When we look forward, we think there are three big sets of uncertainties which will determine how effective exit strategies are. Those uncertainties are around trust, ambition, and controllability. We combined these uncertainties to create a set of four COVID scenarios called pause, rewind, re-record, and fast forward. And there are details of these on our website. And we're already tracking signals of these different scenarios across all regions of the world. Now, this set of impartial global scenarios can be used by governments, investors, firms, and communities to stress test their exit strategies and to guide better investment decisions and choices. And actually, we have to think about how do we have a good quality global energy dialogue that works with these impartial energy futures in order to navigate these investment choices so that we not just emerge from the crisis, but we also can still progress inclusive and orderly global energy transition. Now, the World Energy Congress in 2022 in St. Petersburg will be another exceptional platform for convening the whole of the global energy community. And our community remains open to everybody across all parts of the energy system and industry, and also increasingly what we would call energy plus transition players beyond the sector. Finance, industry, retail, buildings, cities, transport, and the digital sector, including the new voices of the customer-centric energy system that's emerging. St. Petersburg's World Energy Congress in 2022 will also mark our 100th anniversary year, and it'll be a pivotal moment in enabling a next century in managing better energy for all. It will provide another moment for deep reflection, for realistic hope, and for a community-wide celebration of progressing a vision of humanising global energy transition. So the future is for us to write. We're best writing if we recognise there's no one size fits all, but if we're united in diversity and we cooperate, we actually could achieve a better energy future for everyone.
What do you think then is needed to help energy exit the crisis?
I didn't catch that, sorry.
What do you think then is needed to help energy exit the crisis?
So I think energy. There's no single strategy that's going to be effective for everybody, because everybody has different exposures, and the impacts of this crisis have been very uneven and unevenly felt. But we do need to have a common reference set of of possible alternative futures that help us understand how best to make exit strategies and test them, given there are so many uncertainties.
Right. We've just heard from Angela two very important points I've been noting. Another 100 years of realizing new energy ambitions for the benefit of all humanity. What a word. To this, I should add automatically the long-established motto from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, access to safe and affordable energy. And the other point made by Angela was that we need to spend on the right things. Now, what right things? Which of them? Dr. Birnbaum, could you comment on that?
Yeah, from my side, I think we don't know exactly what the future will look like in 100 years. We have always been wrong with every prediction we made in the industry when we looked forward for more than 5 years. But what is 100% sure is that over the next years, actually, we have to invest into innovation. And that is not going to change despite COVID. Yeah? So I give you some examples. We are going to see a shift to e-mobility or hydrogen mobility. That's for sure. The automotive companies are investing this way, and this has implications for us as grid operators. We are going to see a storage coming into the system because it helps us to stabilize the volatility which we have in the future. We are going to see a shift from coal to gas because it's just economic. Actually, Germany is going to get out of coal, not because of a political decision. That is a part of it. The reality is it's going to go out just because of economics. That's really what's driving the shift. We are going, and in that sense, what we as utilities have to do is we have to actually combine all those new technologies, including renewables. And the last point is the system which is then going to develop, we can only control if we fully digitalize it. So if you ask me what has changed due to COVID, it's a brutal shock. We've heard that. But the real point is it's beyond the brutal shock. It's just a moment of hesitation on a technology innovation path, which also Minister Novak, he called it an explosion of new technologies. And that is not going to change. It's going to continue to happen. And that's the challenge really for us. If we want to supply energy for all for another 100 years, we have to figure out how to make innovation work for us.
Right. I do apologize for occasionally looking at my smartphone. It's that very interesting questions are coming in, but we'll come back to them later. Helena Croft in the United States, would you like to comment on what you've just heard?
I think Angela's point and the point made by His Excellency about the lessons learned, I think one of the most important lessons we've learned is the need for mutual cooperation. I mean, I think about so much of the COVID crisis has been about supply chains and securing access to critical medicine, to critical food security. But on the issue of energy security, it's been an enormous moment where nations have come together and realized their mutual dependence. I mean, the low oil price environment that we saw in April was working for no one. And that fostered cooperation amongst countries that we didn't think would necessarily work together to sort of stabilize the markets. And I think about what happened in May, the coming together through OPEC Plus, but also the G20, to the largest supply cut in history to help stabilize that market. I think that has reinforced for everyone the need to actually collaborate to basically stabilize an oil market in the interest of both the consumers and the producers. And we think about certain producers like in the United States, there had been a view that there was incredible dynamism in the industry in the United States, but we really were also dependent on the efforts of other producers to provide a stable price environment for the U.S. industry to thrive. And so to me, one of the positives I've taken away from this horrible human tragedy of COVID-19 is that in terms of the energy systems and in terms of the responses of national leaders, it's actually been a coming together to find a solution to provide the type of economic incentives to revive the industry and to revive investment.
I was listening to you and rejoicing now, were it not for certain other twists surrounding the Nord Stream pipeline in the Baltic. I'm not going to say anything more about it now because I want to switch to Minister Novak because of what you've mentioned about the oil.
Minister Novak, can we say that this OPEC Plus mechanism, even OPEC Plus mechanism, can we say that there is going to be a mechanism on a permanent basis? Well, First, we have to say that the developments around the pandemic, as well as the shocks that we have witnessed, have brought about an understanding among countries of the need to cooperate at a new level to overcome this crisis. In the past, we were seeking to rebalance the market, joining together the efforts of 25 countries of OPEC+. But this time, in April, at the joint conference of OPEC+ and G20, almost all ministers of G20 countries confirmed that they were also willing to participate in the efforts required to ensure the balance in the market. Yes, they didn't join formally because they were prevented by their legislation from joining the OPEC+ mechanism formally. But they used some market mechanism, making their own contribution to rebalancing the market. So the US worked as well, it cooperated. Yes, we had a very active dialogue almost on a daily basis with the Americans back then, and that was very important, and we managed to achieve that despite the crisis. We had some joint discussions and deliberations, and colleagues were telling us that they could take some regulatory measures. Yes, there were several states at the state level. They were prevented from acting at the federal level, but at the state level, they could take some measures to contribute to rebalancing the market. So the circumstances shifted, and we saw a window of opportunity for cooperation. You mentioned Nord Stream 2, a number of other issues that still persist despite all of that. They have a certain influence, unfortunately. Protectionist measures, unfortunately, are still in place despite the crisis. We see some bills in the U.S. Senate that are being considered. Unfortunately, this doesn't help in any way in allowing us to work together. It doesn't give us a chance to do that. And unfortunately, the situation is very dire. 2 billion people do not have access to energy right now. Yes, 2 billion people across the world even do not have access to electricity. Yes, that's true. There are different goals in different parts of the world. Europe is trying to achieve zero carbon emissions, whereas these 2 billion people simply have no access to energy. And they will use any source of energy possible to get access to electricity. There is a rhetorical question. I'm going to voice it. Curiously, Europeans, not all Europeans, are willing to pay twice or thrice for the protection of the environment. But how do we sell this idea in developing worlds? But that is a rhetorical question. Right now, I would like to address Mr. Levinsky. How can we reinforce the system? Well, of course, God forbid the infection returns. But if it were to return, how do we reinforce the system? How do we make it resilient? Well, it seems Mr. Levinsky couldn't hear us. Mr. Levinsky, can you hear me right now? Yes, now I can hear you. First, I would like to thank the organizers of the meeting, and in particular, Madam Wilkinson, for the timely organization of this conference, as well as for the overview of our industry that you have presented to us. I would also like to thank Minister Novak for as chairman of the Russian National Committee of Work. That is very important, especially in the run-up to the 2022 World Energy Congress that is going to be hosted by Russia. Indeed, over the recent years, we've seen an explosion of new technological solutions. And it has been synchronized with the already existing global trends, and this has pushed us towards new solutions. In Rosseti, we agree that we need to optimize our costs and expenditures amid the current conditions. We also have to make some new priorities like digitalization, which is going to be the flagship of development in this industry. But for Rosseti, our priority is, of course, our employees. We have around 220,000 people, and without them, the energy system is nothing but just a bunch of equipment. So what we have to do is to protect our employees, shield them against the risks related to the pandemic, all while preserving reliable energy. I would like to ask another question. As a follow-up to what Mr. Lewinsky has said, this is a question from our colleagues from Interfax. They are following our broadcast. Oh, no. I'm wrong. I'm sorry. It's a question from my colleagues from Global Energy. And I'll use this opportunity to ask this question. There is a discussion about a shift to hydrogen energy system. There are two ways to produce hydrogen. Well, simplistically, of course. One based on coal processing and the other based on electrolysis. And to produce this electricity for electrolysis, you use renewables. The second scenario, the second one, is so far looks like sci-fi. Maybe in future it is going to provide even more jobs. But the first one, using coal to produce hydrogen, is already at hand. Coal is being used to produce hydrogen. And I think as 150,000 people are currently employed in the coal industry. So, Minister Novak, just briefly, first the question to you, and then I'll ask the others to comment on that as well. What about this dilemma, jobs versus new technologies, which are only going to arrive tomorrow? Jobs? You can save them right now. What is more important?
Well, you're very right in raising the issue of hydrogen energy. That is very important for us as well, and Russia is actively engaged in this process together with its companies like Rosseti. And certainly, in the future, the hydrogen economy might account from 7 to 25% in the global energy mix, according to various assessments. As of today, there are two main ways used and considered in production of hydrogen. The first one is from gas, blue hydrogen, as you mentioned, and the second one is to produce it from water through the electrolysis. That's the so-called green hydrogen. And now the majority is shifting towards the so-called green hydrogen, and that is also connected with the workplaces. Yes, certainly that means additional workplaces, the energy mix will change. Yeah, but there will be a certain transition period when one will stop working and the other one is not yet operational. Well, it will happen gradually. I do not think it would be way too sharp, just as the transition to renewable energy sources is happening gradually. But the key problem is that hydrogen will be used not just as a fuel, but also as an energy carrier and a storage for energy. One of the key technological solutions that is not yet there is the creation of big modern accumulators, and hydrogen could be used there. If you have solar and wind, and energy that will develop actively would be produced for hydrogen production as well, that would also be used as fuel element, fuel cell, or will be used for energy accumulation. And that will be a gradual transition, and that would mean diversification of workplaces, introduction of new technologies, and that is a very promising area.
That's this unexpected twist into our conversation. But now that we have mentioned hydrogen, the blue and the green versions, and hydrogen tomorrow with more jobs tomorrow, or hydrogen based on the classic recipe today, keeping the jobs, is there a contradiction? Who else is there anyone else who would like to comment?
If I may make a comment, in Germany we had a large coal industry and we basically have none of that left. And for me the key point is you can only preserve what is economic. And so the question is actually not whether we can prevent hydrogen, so to keep coal. The question is coal competitive? And is hydrogen an alternative in another place? And I think actually what we will see is that hydrogen will come into the system, but it will be only part of the system. It will not be an all hydrogen society, as there will be not an all electric society. And coal actually will protect its position or lose it gradually, depending on its competitiveness. I think that's the key point. You cannot protect coal via political measures, at least not in the long run.
Right. Thank you so much. Lima Croft, let me ask you a sort of follow-up question, but follow-up regarding our last but one item here. In terms of the geopolitical impact, how strongly will the pandemic affect global trade and investment?
Yes, I mentioned before, I think it's sort of a two-tier story. I mean, I can see if we look at issues around protectionism, we do see new discussions about securing supply chains, securing access to critical goods, medical technology, food, an inward-looking approach by governments now saying, like, we need to protect our domestic access to these critical materials if we have another crisis or a second wave of COVID-19. But again, on the energy side, I do think it's remarkable. We've had an issue where, look at President Trump. He had been so highly critical of OPEC and OPEC Plus for years, essentially saying that maybe we should break up this organization because it's a cartel subject to antitrust legislation. And now you have an American president essentially calling for OPEC cuts, calling for greater cooperation, helping to get a deal across the line by intervening at the last minute to get the Mexican participation as part of the agreement. And now he's basically talking about OPEC Plus being a good thing and talking about the assist that it has done to a key American industry, the American energy industry. So in terms of, again, I think it's two-track, but in terms of the energy space, I do think that we are seeing a move towards working together to secure stable prices for investment. But on the other side of the ledger, if we think about other industries and other critical goods, I do think it's an inward-looking approach, like let's secure the supply chain. So I think actually on the energy side, I am more optimistic about creating partnerships and dialogue. But on the other side, I am deeply concerned about a move towards protectionism.
Will you please remind me, I honestly don't remember, during those talks at the OPEC Plus, whatever you call it, there was this moment when the Mexicans didn't want to oblige and were asking the Americans to fulfill their quota. So what was the final decision? Who filled what?
I can give you the official line on that was that essentially the United States would help Mexico comply with the 400,000 barrel a day cut. Mexico did 100,000 of that. But obviously, Minister Novak is the expert on this. He is the excellent chair of the conference. So I will turn
He's not here. He's not here. Let's imagine he's not here. Lima, one more question. The nature of this American-Mexican compromise, was it based on the, do apologize me for the term, but was it based on the Wilsonian view of the world? Or was it rather pushed by the political circumstances and partisan considerations within the United States?
Well, I think what's interesting was the evolving Trump doctrine on the energy side. He became, I think, more Wilsonian because of sheer economics. I think when the price collapse began in April, it wasn't clear whether it was more beneficial for the United States to have a low oil price environment because it would help the U.S. consumer, or whether we needed more robust prices to help the U.S. industry. And so I do think that economics drove a change in how the U.S. viewed energy diplomacy. The need, again, to work with other countries to secure a price that would incentivize investment in a key industry in the United States that was generating jobs. It'll be interesting to see going forward whether this engagement continues and whether organizations like the G20 continue to provide a forum for this type of an important dialogue.
As you and I belong to the same tribe of international relations graduates, I think I must explain to everyone around that the Wilsonian view of things is based on what President Wilson of the United States suggested to the world following the First World War. One of his ideas, the only of his ideas which actually worked, was the creation of the League of Nations, in which the United States did not participate.
Yes.
But that's another thing.
Okay.
Right. Leonhard Birnbaum, can the global energy transition be kept on track? We've mentioned different angles and different crossroads. Can it be kept on track?
Yeah, it depends a little bit what you define as the global energy transition. If you define it as new technologies coming in, which will change the nature of the energy systems towards a more renewable, less carbon intensive, more decentralized system, I said it before, right? This explosion of innovation, as the minister quoted it, and the innovations which I presented as examples, I think that will continue. The other question is, will there be the funding for that going to be around? And I can tell you that right now we have a desperate investor community looking for somehow stable returns. And actually, the energy sector is one of the best areas probably to provide exactly that. The energy, I might say, outside oil and gas maybe, because in the regulated space in which we are acting, we are quite resilient. Demand is actually quite stable, as we have seen in this brutal COVID shock. And therefore, I think, yes, there will be financial means around, and there will be innovation around, and therefore the change is going to continue. Whether exactly at the speed which people, assumed we would see a year ago, so that's to be debated. But I have no doubts that if we look 10 years forward, we will see a very different world from today. And if we look 30 years forward, even more.
Okay, let me insert here yet another question which we've received online here, and that's for you actually. If anyone else wants to comment, please do so, but as a follow-up. It's a question from the Russian news agency called Interfax. I'll have to quote it in Russian because the original is in Russian.
We are all very well aware of the climate and energy purposes and objectives of the European Union up to 2050. We are also very well aware of how we managed to comply with the objective for 2020. Those objectives were underachieved. But now we understand it very well that it's not the Brussels and their models that define the energy mix, but unpredictable factors like the well-being of the bats in China and so on and so forth. Let us try to predict what type of events or even catastrophes will define the energy mix in Europe for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, that is a trap, this question, because I said that all
it's
our...
from journalists,
all our forward projections have been wrong. I said it before. And nevertheless, I'm now asked for a forward projection. But I would repeat what I said. I do not believe that the energy transition is just a wild idea which has no foundation. The foundation is the change in technology, and also a desire by at least European society. Let me just speak for the European society. And if we look at now how the means are allocated on the Brussels level from the recovery packages, there are basically two conditions. It needs to be digital and or green. Ideally, it's both. In that case, you get money. If you look at investors, what they are asking for is it needs to be ESG compliant. Then you can have money. We are seeing that if we emit a green bond, we are getting better financing terms than if we are emitting a normal bond. So therefore, I really believe that what I just said, the energy world is going to change, is just a fact, and it's actually not driven by completely random shocks which might play out in any different way. It's actually driven by a technology innovation which by now is actually changing the system. And let me just add one point. If you add 10% renewables, you still have 90% conventionals in the market, and you have just changed 10% of your asset base. But those 10% of renewables are going to take out 90% of the margin, because the margin of the industry is destroyed already with very little coming in. long before the asset park is completely replaced. And therefore, I believe it's not going to be stopped.
Валентинович, у меня есть один злобный коллега.
Mr. Novak, I have one very jealous colleague who was watching you during the OPEC meeting, and he had a poker face at the time when he was saying that. And I think he was right. I do not really understand whether you agree to what was mentioned just now or not. You have really a poker face on you all the time. Coming back to the conversation we were having before, all those beautiful ideas of the shift towards green energy in Europe to a large degree are based on the huge subsidies provided by the European Commission and national governments. However, there is an important reservation to make. Lately, we've heard discussions on where to move forward, and it was not just The Guardian on Financial Times, but even China Daily is writing that probably, despite low oil prices, it is time to move on to green energy. But again, we have to get back to those subsidies. And now I've packed several questions into one, but this is the time to ask you about that.
Well, first, I was looking calmly. Oh, you were calm. Yes, and I was nodding in agreement with what colleagues have just said. The energy is going to be defined. Its future is going to be defined by new technologies that are going to be invented. As far as renewables are concerned, they are becoming increasingly competitive. And as we can see, the costs of electricity production and equipment are decreasing, making the industry more competitive. Yes, because of the pandemic, some projects have had to be postponed, but still such big companies, even oil and gas companies such as Deep Soul, Shell, BP, have announced that they're going to diversify their business, moving towards low-carbon industry. So this is not just under the pressure of governments because they want that. I think everyone understands full well that without that, they are not going to survive. This is a trend which is very strong and which is increasingly gaining momentum. In order to remain competitive, to save their margins, they have to invest in R&D and technologies. They have to expand their businesses in this dimension. In particular, to be in compliance with the standards issued by governments. Many governments are pursuing this track. They simply impose standards. For instance, in the consumption of energy, which is produced with low carbon emissions. And that is why, incidentally, gas is still has a great potential because it's low carbon emission source of energy, and I think it is still going to be used despite an increased share of renewables.
Try to be provocative, all of this to build a bridge towards Angela, and to ask her a question which sort of, is an umbrella one for what we've heard. Dr. Wilkinson, in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on climate change, because we were dancing about the climate change notion right now, is international coordinated action really still the only way to meet climate targets?
Thank you. Let me tell you what we're picking up from our surveys. There is not a single unified perspective on the implications of the COVID crisis or the reactions to it for the climate change agenda. We see perspectives divided between those that think it's just delaying the existing agenda and the Paris Agreement commitments. We see people who think it will derail it because there's going to be much more attention to health. There's going to be much more attention to other things that matter. And there are other people who think that a third of the perspectives is also that it's going to redesign the climate change agenda. What we know is this is not a crisis of technology. This is not a crisis of finance. This is a crisis of society. This is a deeply human sociological crisis that we're emerging from. And I come back to what I was saying about our crisis scenarios and what you need to manage as you exit crisis. We have to think of the sociological effects of this crisis in terms of human ambition. Is the ambition to return to the post-COVID normal, or is it to go somewhere completely different? We have to think of trust. this crisis is not just, it's creating new forms of international cooperation and coordination that Halima has indicated, at the same time as it's creating suspicion and between governments and societies and between different parts of society. So trust is going to come out of this in a different way. And the controllability of this virus is not a given. We don't know when a vaccine will be available or how effective it will be. And maybe the action we will only be able to take is really going to be behavioural. And if it's behavioural, then we can expect a very different agenda around climate change. So I can't tell you what the impact is going to be. I can tell you perspectives are divided, and we're going to have to navigate a variety of futures, going back to Leo's point that every prediction they make over 5 years is wrong. Well, now it's time to embrace the fact that the future's a bit plural at the moment, but actually by navigating that plurality together, we might find better ways of making good investment decisions that take care not just of this health crisis, but climate crisis and the crisis of inequalities that has been bubbling up before this situation.
Right, I have a question for you here. In fact, let me show my bad behavior, because I'm going to return to the nuclear issue. But we have a question here from Alexei Komoltsev, who says, how do you assess the prospects for the development of nuclear energy? To which I'd add the contradiction, which I noticed mentioned before. Whilst Germany is demolishing its nuclear plants, the UK has rediscovered the merits of nuclear energy. Now, of course, Britain now is outside the European Union. As I said before, Europe is anywhere else other than us ourselves. Yet, could you comment on the nuclear energy which is being developed in this country? Particularly attention to nuclear energy is being paid in the new energy strategy adopted by the Russian government 2 weeks ago. But yet we have these contradictions in Europe. We have another view of it in the United States, and a lot of countries are building their new nuclear reactors, be it China, India, Turkey, etc. Where are we with the nuclear energy? Yes. Well,
okay.
You lead the World Energy Council, Angela. You should know everything.
I do. I think that if let's not forget, we do have a demand tsunami coming towards us, and we are going to need multiple different technologies to meet the increasing demand and needs for energy into the next century. And we have seen a change in nuclear technologies, and we know that no energy technology can assume its social license to operate. All of them have to earn them. It doesn't matter if you're an overhead high voltage power cable, or if you're a wind farm in Europe and you're associated with visual pollution, or in Latin America where you're associated as not being modern. We all have to think about social license to operate. And the nuclear industry is challenged by that in many parts of the world. And it's also finding a renaissance for new nuclear technology and fleet production of nuclear power systems in other parts of the world. So I'm not sitting on the fence here when I say there is no one-size-fits-all perspective on nuclear energy, and that we will see it grow in some parts of the world with a different approach to the technology, and in other parts of the world it will continue to be challenged because it still has to address its waste issues as well as its economic performance issues around project management.
Right. We have a question here from someone called Natalia Mikhailova. Rings a bell, but she hasn't identified her corporate belongings, so to say. What is the impact of cheap oil on the development of alternative energy sources? Well, we've already touched upon this question, but it's really very important because you have two views here. One was recently expressed by academician Dinkin in this country. He is president of the Institute for International Relations and World Economy. He actually stated that given the low oil prices, they've risen a bit, but not so much, the non-conventional sector is no longer viable. He was interestingly joined by the chair of the International Committee of Global Agency, Nobel Prize winner, Rek Wei-chung, who didn't say he was glad because of that, but he said, yes, it looks like that's the state of affairs. But then at the same time, I've already mentioned several publications, both in Russia and in the West, which say that no, that given what's happened with COVID, we are actually now entering a stage where non-conventional energy could be so much more viable, or at least desirable. we've mentioned it several times during our conversation. In fact, this is a question for everyone. We haven't heard from Mr. Levinsky for a while, so I'll start with him. It takes time for translation, so let's wait.
Yes, thank you. As a matter of fact, as far as renewables are concerned and non-conventional sources, I have to say that this is the future. Microgeneration is yet another trend entering our life, and in that regard, digital services will have to be developed, which will allow integrating the grid management and consumption governance industry. This will allow the consumer to channel excesses of energy produced locally to the grid and take in energy when they need it. And this is certainly going to be a priority. The adaptability of networks and the current challenges are such that they need to be able to reintegrate with any type of consumer and satisfy their needs. If such a network is indeed built, then it is going to be viable, it is going to be competitive. Otherwise, it is not going to be viable. And we talk a lot about sources, but we often lose sight of batteries and storage facilities. And this is going to be very important, especially in the coming decade and the coming 5 decades. This is going to have a huge impact upon the networks. The greater the storage capacity that is introduced, the less centralized the network is going to be. It is going to split into microgrids, microgeneration grids, and these are the trends we have to keep in mind when we chart forward our strategy, when we try to answer the challenges. I'm going to explain to the wider audience that electricity is produced. There are several peaks in the morning, in the evening. At a certain part of day, there is a plateau, which is the term we know from the COVID-19 situation. And there are excesses of energy production. And so as not to lose them, we need some storages, batteries based on lithium. Some of them are involving. Let me get back to my question. So given the low prices of oil, of coal, and of gas, is a pause going to be taken in the development of renewables? An alternative, non-conventional.
What do you think about it?
If I may take this, I think the first item is, if we're making investment decisions, we are not making them for 2 years, we're making them for 20 years. And so the question of low prices for us in the short term never has been the determining factor in our industry. If I would know the oil price for the next 20 years, I would be rich and retired. But so if I have now to make an assessment now, the question for me is, do I make a long-term investment into my system based on low commodity prices away from renewables? And currently, if I compare the total cost of producing a kilowatt hour from wind, from solar, from coal, from nuclear, actually nuclear, coal and so on have the advantage of being clearly available whenever I need them, so they're not volatile like wind and solar, but they are significantly more expensive. And with technology progress, for example in storage, I can bank on the assumption that I might be able to provide electricity significantly cheaper in a renewable way. So if you're looking for investments today, for investors, I can tell you it's much easier to find an investor who wants to co-invest in wind and solar than to find somebody who wants to co-invest in nuclear or coal. And therefore, I believe the path for renewables will continue just because of the availability of funds and the technology progress.
Helima, your smile is truly enigmatic. What does it mean?
Well, I think one of the interesting questions goes back to what Angela talked about in terms of energy poverty. And I think in a low oil price environment, There are nations around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that simply lack access to energy, where people use biomass to heat their homes. And so I do fear in a low oil price environment, the argument of the climate agenda becomes more challenging in these countries because they simply say we can't leave millions of people behind in poverty. So cost is such a primary driver for these countries when they think about energy access. It is seen as so critical for development, for lifting people out of poverty. So I think that's an important angle to really consider is when we think about the consuming countries that are much lower down in terms of economic development and what their needs are going to be for energy. And in a low oil price environment, I think it's sometimes more challenging to make the case for renewables in terms of those countries, in terms of their energy mixes.
Right, let me ask you a very difficult, complicated and complex question then. I have friends who've been calling me, and especially the gurus at the Global Association, because we give this prize for major achievements. We've got gurus who can comment. So I've been receiving telephone calls in this last couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, from wealthy friends of mine, mind you, wealthy friends of mine, who are happy to install a solar panel on their private house on a nice lawn in the countryside so that they get clean energy, help the environment, and they are happy to pay for that. They are happy to pay the difference. If we include this expensive renewable sector in the centralized system, and there is a gap between the high price for clean energy and the low price for conventional, let's put it this way, energy, who pays the difference? In typical circumstances, we'll be talking taxes here, but we're not talking taxes. We're talking about a price which arrives at your doorstep in the form of a bill from an electricity company. So do you distribute different sort of bills to different to households with different incomes, or how will it work? I know it's a cul-de-sac question, but it's interesting. Yeah.
I think I can take that one. Why? Because I believe on a global level, there are very few, if any, utilities who have actually integrated more renewables into their grid system than E.ON. That's because we have massive wind areas in Germany. We have areas where we are feeding in 250% of what we are consuming in terms of renewable production. So we have all those problems. Now, the answer to your question is it depends. It depends actually on the regulation, whether the national choice has been to put it into the budget, into the state budget, or into tax credits like in the US, or into the energy bill like in Germany. So I think there's not one uniform answer. In the end, my answer is it's always the customer who pays everything, because either via taxes or via the energy bill, somebody pays, and that is the consumer of the energy or the taxpayer, but in most cases that's the same person. But I want to be very clear, what your wealthy friends are doing is a perfect rational economic decision. First, they can do it even if they just feel good about it, and even if it's not economically rational. But if they are then replacing energy, which they're getting otherwise from the grid, with their own production, it makes economic sense. So, and that obviously then depends whether you're living in a sunny area or somewhere where there's less sunshine.
Okay.
But even in Germany, it makes sense. Yeah.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 5 minutes left on the air. So if we want to be on the air before we say goodbye, we must be very short now. My very last question from the questions which are coming here. Polina Stroganova asks us, ISCCS, carbon capture and storage, still a viable new investments for energy companies given the large-scale investment? That's a question. Have we got time for that? There's actually a crossroads here. We either answer this one or I give you time for your final reflections. What do we prefer? If you ask me, as I have to be exercising order, I'd rather switch to the final remarks if I may. Okay? Will please, Polina Stroganova, apologize me. We haven't got time. Angela, you initiated this this session. Do share your reflections with us. You've got a minute and a half.
minute and a half to share a reflection. I just want to say that for the last couple of minutes, we've been talking about what we tend to confuse as global energy transition by talking only about electrification. And I want to say that 20% of the world energy system is currently electrified. 80% of it requires heat and fuels of a different type at the moment, and we've still got a lot of demand to meet. Moving forward, we have to ensure that we can find affordable solutions. The costs of energy are not just about production, they're about transport and storage and in use, and that we still have a long way to go. I do think we'll see carbon capture and storage piloted. We have to get a proof point on it. I do think we'll see more nuclear. I do think we'll see more hydro. I do think we'll see oil and gas and others shifting towards the circular carbon economy and looking for other investments around net zero carbon. I think if we're really going to be on track for a global energy transition by 2040, every energy source has to make a contribution, and it has to become affordable, reliable, and clean. Net zero carbon. That doesn't exclude the fossil fuel industry. It's a call for the fossil fuel industry to step up and play a part in meeting demand in a more affordable and clean way for a large part of the world.
I've been counting. You've just articulated 8 topics for roundtables in St. Petersburg. Good. We are on the way. We've got 3 minutes left, so who wants to speak and will not ever, ever, ever forgive me for not giving floor to him or her? Helima, your final reflections, 1.5 minutes, please.
For me, I think one of the things, I didn't mention it earlier, but I think the volatility that we've seen in oil prices after the COVID-19 crisis just lends added urgency for the big oil-producing nations to really speed up their diversification efforts as we go into the energy transitions. I mean, there are so many countries that have been hit so hard by this collapse in oil prices, and while they have risen, they still have to go to the IMF seeking emergency support. They're still having to cut their budgets, make very painful choices. So as we think about energy transition, I think the diversification imperative for these oil-producing nations only grows.
Leonhard, very briefly, 1 minute.
I just said it that we are building an energy system driven by innovation, which is going to be completely different. I would build on one point that Helena made. I think actually we can only control such a world if we actually digitize it, but also if we cooperate it. If we are building a nation by nation, energy islands, it's not going to work. So I think it's about innovation, but it's also about cooperation to be successful in the future.
К студии Rosseti, тоже минута.
Over to you, 1 minute as well. Well, I have to say there is no one unique recipe that would be confirmed by the many years of experience. We are also hitting the same road of changes and transition. And in this regard, the growth of trust between corporations and companies is very important, and the World Energy Council has a role to play there for sure. All of us will benefit from that. And the challenges that we're facing today force us to introduce new tools for managing production and business processes. We have to exchange best practices, and it is increasingly important today to make sure we all benefit from those best practices. We came up with an initiative to create a regular platform for contact between the CEOs of the leading energy companies, and we got support from Anal, Turner, Japanese TEPCO Power Grid, South Korean KEPCO. And that type of platform will enable us to introduce best practices also in the condition of the pandemic situation that we're living through today. Indeed, we are having fruitful conversation there, and we hope to continue it in the future. Well, now I have to say something. You have 40 seconds, Mr. Nowak, end of show afterwards. So, are we going to St. Petersburg for the World Energy Congress? Well, that's all decided. We are hosting it in October 2022, and we're looking forward to welcoming all our colleagues in St. Petersburg then. I'd like to thank all of you for participation in this discussion. I only have to say that energy is the key driver of our economy. We're discussing it together, both producers and consumers of energy. We're searching for the best modern solutions. That's the future of our energy that will be conditioned by the competition, market relation, and the new technologies. Thank you very much. Many thanks to Minister Novak. Many thanks to the head of Rosseti.
That's it for today. We're just on time. Congratulations on being punctual. Thank you so much indeed, and see you in St. Petersburg. And before that, of course. Спасибо. Окончание трансляции на России-24. Передаем эстафету нашим коллегам.
Thank you very much. We're done now.